So I know we just have an hour, so I think it's time that we go ahead and get started on our talk about successful relationships and BDD. Yes, you can have them. All right. So as we get started, I'm going to just to mention that I'm going to introduce the slides, and then Robyn and Chris will participate throughout. So why have a talk on relationships and BDD? I suppose it's fairly obvious, but I think for people who have BDD, you certainly understand that relationships can often be strained. And I should start by also saying that one of the reasons the three of us are giving this talk is that we all are clinicians, but we all are people who also have lived with BDD for many years. And so we do look at it from the perspective of being sufferers as well as people who also treat it and specialize in treating BDD. So we do know that relationships and BDD can be very, very difficult, and it's not uncommon. There are many people who have experienced, failed relationships and divorce, in part because of all the difficulties connected to the BDD. I often say when I give speeches that it is very difficult to be involved in a relationship with somebody else while you're also having a relationship with a part of your body. So, Robyn, Chris, what are your thoughts?
So I feel like for me, and when I think of clients and people that struggle with BDD, I think, we see the distorted thoughts regarding our actual appearance. And what, we've talked about in general is this notion of going deeper beyond just the physical appearance part. And so one of the things is there's a strong distorted belief about oneself. And yes, it is, let's say, somebody's skin or hair or facial feature, but it often makes a person feel like they aren't worth it or valued enough to be in a relationship. And so I think sometimes people with BDD get lost in their distortion. They may be concerned about their appearance part, but I think that it also translates for them thinking, do I even deserve to be in a relationship? Could somebody possibly love me? Would a partner want to date me? So they have so many obstacles that they would, in terms of exposures and putting themselves out there. But the notion of when a person feels defective about how they look and ultimately how they feel about themselves, how do you navigate that and feel like I could step up and open myself up and be vulnerable, which is difficult enough for anybody, to allow themselves to be in a relationship with another person, especially when the relationship with themselves is so rocky.
And I'll just add quickly too, relationships, and I'll speak on it when we talk about personal experience, but relationships can often be used as a reassurance tool. So I know for clients, myself included, it's like, if I can find someone that finds me attractive, then maybe this body part or body parts isn't as unattractive as I thought. And then what Robyn just said, when we get into a relationship with BDD, this is one of our most vulnerable moments. We're face to face with someone. They see us in all different lighting. They see us in different places. They see us when we first wake up and when we don't camouflage. So there's something really vulnerable about being in a relationship with BDD. And that's why this talk is important. It's a very, very difficult thing to navigate when dealing with body dysmorphic disorder.
All right. Well, speaking of our personal relationships, the three of us are going to share just a little bit about ourselves and our history with BDD. As being the senior member of our panel today, my BDD first started when I was 19, which was 73. The focus of my BDD has always been about my hair. We know that BDD can shift body parts over time, but for me, it's always focused on my hair and the fear that I was losing my hair. Now, at 19, I was experiencing a lot of stress in college. My parents were going through a divorce. There were a lot of financial problems to the point where the school wanted me to leave, though my parents did intervene and I was able to stay. I wasn't dating, and did cause significant stress for me. Now, was I not dating because of the BDD, or did the BDD have something to do with my not dating? I think that's a important issue to think about. And perhaps most important is my own personal history of trauma and being physically abused. And I do think that in terms of developing BDD, that probably played a very significant role in the development of it for myself. And we do know that about 80% of people who have BDD have some sort of childhood maltreatment in their background. So I do think of everything I've mentioned, that's probably the most significant. Um, I do think over the next 10 years following when I first began showing symptoms, which by the way was, I think, about 13 or so years before BDD was even a recognized diagnosis. But I did pretty well during that time. I engaged in a lot of very compulsive behaviors. I got to the point where I stopped essentially combing my hair. I didn't like seeing hair in the brush, and so I would avoid any activity that would result in my seeing hair. So I just, I would wash it every so often and just stop combing it, and grew my hair out, and I looked like one of the rock stars of the 70s. I did function pretty well. I went to graduate school, received my MSW. I didn't get depressed at that time. Um, but my symptoms really worsened a great deal when I turned 30. I think I was, in some respects, very disappointed at sort of my quality of life at that time. And the symptoms just really intensified significantly. And that's when I did start getting very depressed. However, I did meet my first wife at that point, and remarkably, my BDD symptoms, although they were strong when I met her, my BDD symptoms really weakened considerably. As I began in the relationship and was very, very happy, the BDD did begin taking a back seat. It was still 10 years before I would be diagnosed with BDD, and my rituals were all very much in place still. Now, she was, to her credit, in the beginning, very, very supportive, but as my BDD began becoming much stronger over time, it did take a very significant toll on my marriage. And we were divorced within 3 years, actually. I became very, very depressed, very socially withdrawn. Although I continued to work, I did so with great difficulty. And after a couple of years, my wife decided that she needed to divorce. And looking back on it, I certainly understand why. Now, to be fair, I don't think the BDD was the primary reason. The marriage had other problems, but the BDD certainly didn't help. Now, lastly, I am married again. I did make a point here. There's only two marriages, and I hope it stays that way. I'm not looking for another. I did get married again 4 years after the first marriage ended, and lo and behold, the BDD exploded again, and I mean really exploded. And I got more and more depressed. I began pursuing therapy, began taking medication, and did have periods when I did quite well. This was also a time when my wife and I, even prior to getting married, bought a house together. And in California, that's not an easy thing to do. And so there was a lot of stress with that. Our daughter was born 2 months early, and my wife became seriously ill during the pregnancy, though. So there was a lot of stress and a lot of relationship stress, too. And it wasn't really a surprise, thinking about it later, that the BDD just exploded. All right, I think that's it for me for now. And let's see who's next here. Robyn.
So I'll just go quickly in saying that, my story is essentially I was bullied as a child for my appearance, and I internalized those self-beliefs, and it had a massive impact on me when I went to college. My diagnosis didn't come until I was 22, but I really believe I had the diagnosis since my early teens. And so essentially for me, the thought of relationships, especially when I was in college, like did not cross my mind, because as many people with BDD, when they see their defective body part, and for me, it was my skin, for me, it was my face. I know for myself, I felt like no one would ever want to be with me. I could barely handle being with myself. So I just don't deserve to be in relationships. And so when I was in college, I had a lot of friends. I just essentially had this thought process that I was ugly. This is prior to the BDD diagnosis, but I just didn't think that men were attracted to me. And so I just didn't even really broach that. It was something I didn't really deal with until I was about 21 years old, where all of a sudden I was getting attention from men, and it actually felt very uncomfortable for me. And ironically, after the summer of getting a lot of attention, was my first episode of being housebound for over 30 days related to me perceiving my skin to be very broken out, which led me to not go back to my first semester of senior year. And so I still didn't get the BDD diagnosis. I did get it at 22. And while evidence-based treatment is very effective, the CBT ERP, I will tell you that I have never worked with a clinician that ever said to me, what is your social life like? How is your dating and relationships? How does your BDD impact you outside of checking the mirror and not liking what you look like? So dating in my 20s, I thought I was in recovery from BDD, but I didn't really date properly. I used the term like I felt like I was Cinderella. I had a very short window of time that I felt I can put myself out there. I felt like I can go on a date at 7 p.m., but by 10, 11 p.m., I felt so disgusted with how I looked and felt about myself that I would have to go back and retreat into my home. And so in my 20s, then I dated, but I didn't essentially have the ability to form a relationship with anybody because I couldn't really sustain being out for long periods of time. And ironically, that was nothing ever discussed in any of my therapy, which I make it very clear with clients, like we need to go beyond like what you see in the mirror and decrease compulsions and see how the BDD is impacting all facets of life. So as I began to myself really have the value of wanting to be in a relationship, I actually did not enter into a real relationship until I was 28 years old. I had 2 serious relationships, 28 to 30, and I did disclose to them that I had BDD. I don't think they truly understood it. I personally never utilized them as support. I think that I ironically found men that were very critical of appearance, which I find ironic considering I have BDD, and I terminated those relationships. I still feel very strongly that, and as I look back at the trajectory of my life and understand how BDD really, really permeated my life, that only more recently in the last 5 years do I really see how there was a lot more work that needed to be done within myself to feel like I could actually be ready to be in a relationship. And that BDD really was something that essentially led me to the relationship I was in. Because when you don't love yourself and when you don't want to be with yourself, it essentially will attract people that may not be the most healthy for you, that may make you feel like you're not enough, which essentially people with BDD feel on its own. And that was my trajectory with relationships. I will say I did get engaged when I was 37 to somebody that I have known since I was 23. It was not a great experience. I think that some of it was me, but it was definitely a relationship where a lot of people with BDD that I see, and even myself, is like when somebody tells you they love you because you feel unlovable, you don't want to leave something because you think maybe there's nothing else out there. And it wasn't the healthiest relationship. I ended up getting engaged to him again the following year, the second time, and it didn't end up working out. And I've learned so much since that situation. And I learned so much about myself. And I never realized truly the correlation between having this disorder, body dysmorphic disorder, and how it essentially relates to not only romantic, intimate relationships, but all relationships. And I essentially have really dug deep within myself to see, okay, where am I at today? I am single. I do have a child. So that was something that was very, very important to me. I'm a single mom. My child's almost 3. I am, yes, we can have relationships with BDD. And I feel like I'm definitely in the place of my life where I am ready to be open to the right partner. I am ready to understand what that means versus what I was doing before. I think I was dating based upon people liking me for how I looked. I think I wasn't able to emotionally connect to people because I felt I wasn't good enough. I didn't want to be vulnerable. And so I feel like I've learned a lot, and I think people can really learn a lot. And I think the important part is to understand that there is this correlation, and that if you essentially don't feel good about yourself, how do you attract that partner that's going to work? Is there a possibility you'll attract a very healthy relationship? Of course. But I think that the work starts with yourself. And then when you're working on yourself, then I think that helps to move forward. And what the last thing I'm just going to say is that I wish that my clinicians helped me, because I was in recovery in my 20s. I definitely had relapses, but no one ever asked me about my relationships. No one ever thought there was a connection between the two. And it's like, to me, I can look back at everything and be like, there's a very direct correlation for me feeling defective about how I looked, for me ultimately feeling defective as a person, which BDD often makes you feel, and then thus being in relationships that are very unhealthy, toxic, and really almost unable to really thrive or survive. And so I just think this talk is so important because I do think that people, one, need to know they can be in a relationship, but two, the importance of understanding all these dynamics that come together.
Thank you, Robyn. Chris, before we turn to you, I have a question. Are we supposed to be taking questions or watching the chat box, or is that even possible?
You know what? Somebody wrote us a nice comment, so I just replied back, thank you. But I figured, like, if we did have questions and we wanted to interweave them, or if we wanted to answer them at the end, we could always totally do that.
Okay, sounds good. All right, Chris, you're up.
Yeah, so for me, my dating story is a little bit different. I'm gay, and when I was in high school, there wasn't really opportunities to date. So my BDD was very individualized. So what I mean by that is, for me, the BDD was such a focus. So in high school, I started showing signs of BDD as a child. And it was always much more internal because there wasn't really an option for me to date. So when I was in high school, my hyperfixation was definitely skin. Later, when I graduated, it also turned to my nose size, it turned to my under eyes, it turned to my forehead shape, and just basically feeling like my face was put together incorrectly. But dating didn't really hit me in high school when my BDD started. Once I was out of high school and I started to feel comfortable with myself and wanted to start dating, I had in my head that I had to look perfect before I could date. So I actually still to this day have the journal from that period of time. I was probably like 19, but I had a list of all the things that I wanted to fix on my face and my body. And some of it I could do normal ways like the gym and get some sun, but some things were going to need surgeries and laser treatments. And as a 19-year-old, my whole motivation to work was to make money for those different changes that I wanted. So I had this list, and but because my BDD kept getting worse, because we know it's not really about appearance, I never dated. I ended up getting treatment, really good treatment, luckily, for body dysmorphic disorder. And towards the end of my treatment, part of my recovery was to start dating. So that was one thing that I jumped into. And I actually met someone, my partner at the time was one of the first people I met out of treatment, and we got into a relationship, and BDD blew up. I mean, it was in recovery, like Robyn said, but I had never dated with BDD. So once I got into the relationship, it was so entrenched in BDD. There was a lot of reassurance that I needed. So I would consistently ask my partner when we'd be out and I'd see another guy that was good looking. Am I better looking than him? Do you still love me? I don't think I got to the gym today. Does my body still look okay? I'm breaking out. Are you going to break up with me? Like, there was a constant need for reassurance. Could go to the next slide.
Okay. Why isn't it turning?
It's like, no, you have to stay on the slide. There we go. So yeah, so I would constantly ask for reassurance. I think one thing that was really difficult being in a same-sex relationship is I actually saw my partner as competition. So I felt like I needed to be more attractive to other people than me. Now, my partner at the time looked nothing like me. Like, you can't see because I'm sitting down, but I'm about 6'1", 6'1", kind of a bigger build. He was dark haired, dark skin, dark eyes, much shorter than me. I think it was like 5'8", a lot thinner build. So we looked different. And so it was never really, to most people that don't have BDD, that one was better looking. We just looked different. But when we'd go out, if people didn't know we were in a relationship and he got hit on more than I did, or somebody said he was attractive and not I, it was crushing to the BDD. And I'd find myself going home and getting in my mirror and, pushing my face around and wishing that I could change certain things. I always needed to get attention from other people. I never cheated when we're in the relationship. We would have breakups to makeups and stuff, but I always needed attention from others. And he'd get very upset that I was always asking for attention from other people, but it was so entrenched in this need to constantly get fed that I was good enough, I was attractive enough, etc. Even through sex. I mean, every partner sometimes is tired or would work a lot, but if he was ever not interested in having sex, it was immediately something was wrong with my face, my body, my skin, etc. We eventually broke up, like Scott said, not solely because of BDD, it was a big part of it, but I always had to be in back-to-back relationships. And if there was a period of time that I wasn't in a relationship, I had to be with someone, whether it was sexually, whether it was romantically, whether it was dating, because that was such a big source of reassurance that I was okay. And it was like a drug. And if I wasn't with somebody at a time, then I felt like, oh my God, it's because I'm not attractive, something's wrong. So I needed that constant reassurance from a partner. Go to the next slide. I went back to therapy. Like Robyn said, one of the hard things is like I had done therapy and I was good enough, but there was a lot of stuff going on that didn't come out until I got into relationships. So I went back to therapy and addressed this. And once I left treatment, I started getting into much healthier relationships. I actually made a rule with myself that I was not to bring my BDD into my relationships anymore. So no asking for reassurance, needing to compare, no jumping into a relationship or dating strictly because I need the attention. At the time, this was way before becoming a therapist, a friend of mine owned like a gay lounge bar, et cetera. And so I was helping him out and was working there. And I would meet people and I just noticed how healthier my relationships were when BDD was not present and I was in a healthy mindset. I put this picture up because like a lot of people with BDD, I hated pictures. And the last picture I had that was like done well was in high school at like 16. And so part of my recovery, I think I was 24 in that picture, 25. Part of my recovery was to take a picture. My therapist is like, you need to take a picture and give it to your family. I'm making this stupid face in the picture, so you can definitely laugh in the chat about it. But the point is, like, I finally took the picture. And for me, it was like, I was good enough the second round of therapy to not only take that picture, but really to be healthy in relationships. And so I'm excited to get into the rest of the talk. But my big take home is, you know, I was just not in a place with therapy the first round. And I put a lot of my partners through a lot of unneeded hell, for a lack of a better word, because I just wasn't healthy and I was almost using them as a compulsion. And it wasn't until really addressing that component in therapy that I finally realized, like, okay, I need to handle this different. And therapy worked. It helped me the second round.
That's terrific. Thank you, Chris.
Absolutely.
So let's get to talking about relationships and BDD. I do think that in the beginning, you really need to be able to ask yourself, are you ready for one? Relationships are very, very hard work, even if you don't have BDD. And I think a core element of any relationship is a sense of trust. And if that doesn't exist, I don't know how a relationship really survives. And I often also say that I think in my work anyway, I believe that people with BDD are amongst the most psychologically wounded patients a therapist is ever going to come into contact with. And I think that in one respect, one thing that's been damaged a great deal is this ability to trust. And so I do think that as people begin relationships, that needs to be one of the first questions, is that, do you truly trust this person? Chris, Robyn, any thoughts on that?
I'm just thinking about it's resonating, and we've never actually had this conversation as colleagues and friends, but I think I could essentially go back to my 3 relationships, and I did not trust any of them. And I think I never thought about that. And I think I just wanted that connection, and I didn't necessarily. I figured I keep, again, from this BDD mindset of whatever I can get, I can get. And I hear this a lot. And I want people to understand and separate their BDD from, like, in the sense of being like, you are more than just what the BDD is telling you, and understands, like, in any relationship, that is the cornerstone of a healthy relationship, is trust. And sometimes the BDD clouds you into thinking, okay, this is all you can get. And so even if you don't trust this person, or it doesn't feel settling to you, like, just stay in it because you have BDD, and, like, either it's comfortable, you feel safe in it because, you know, you feel reassurance, or you don't feel like you have to put yourself out there. But I do think trust is really crucial for any kind of relationship. And so it is an important thing to really, you know, you can really kind of figure out pretty early on, based upon what the person is doing and how they're acting towards you and others. Is this a relationship that's going to be healthy for you? Is this a relationship that's going to bring you joy? And again, not looking for a relationship based on reassurance, but just healthy components of a relationship. And the cornerstone of that definitely is trust.
Yeah, I would say for me, you know, somebody had put in the questions about, you know, being a gay man and resonating. Our community is so hyper focused on appearance, and there was such judgment on that. And just like you said, Robyn, I didn't trust my partners at all. And I wasn't ready to be in a relationship. And I absolutely want the take home message from this talk to be that everybody deserves a relationship, BDD or not. I just wasn't ready. And I think that would have been my advice to my younger self is after that second round of treatment, I was much better and ready. But we have to trust the person. And we have a question in the question that I could answer right now. They basically asked, like, when do you recommend discussing it? If so, how, at what stage, language, context, what to focus on? I think that last question that Scott put in here is, do you trust the person, is key. My first relationship found some of my material from therapy and kind of used it as a weapon and would sort of like poke fun and make comments because they weren't mentally healthy themselves to do that. For me, I think that bringing BDD up in a relationship, there has to be trust there. And remember, it is your choice of how much or how little that you want to open up about. So I think if you're in a relationship and you've been with the person long enough that you see it entering those more kind of serious stages, you don't want to tell somebody you may only go on 2 dates with, right? But somebody that you're in a more consistent relationship with, and you start talking about things that are a little bit deeper, I don't think it's a bad thing to just say like, hey, I just want to be honest with you. I do deal with some body image stuff, specifically a disorder called BDD, and see if they're interested. I think it makes more sense if you trust the person, if it's long term, you have some kind of commitment with each other. I do think it's important, especially if the symptoms start to interfere with the relationship. It gives them an understanding why we may do or not do something.
And I
I
just want to say
also,
just one last thing to
yeah,
that, because I did disclose when I was 28 to my first serious relationship I was in. And I guess it was a new experience for me to disclose it. And so instead of me really describing it, he took it upon himself to Google it. And trigger warning, Googled it and basically asked me if I was going to kill myself. And
oh
so
my goodness.
having this conversation where I was feeling extremely vulnerable about sharing something that I felt so shameful about, and like finally like being in my first serious relationship and sharing it, and I guess his response to it, it was a very hard thing for me. And I think it's again, I think it's, if you're in therapy, navigating that conversation with the therapist about how you might want to approach it, giving information, but essentially like telling the person, like, this isn't just me. And I think that's the work you do also with therapy. Like, we have body dysmorphic disorder, but that is not our only defining quality as a human being. And so, yes, it may be something that comes into the relationship and plays a part in certain situations where you are struggling, but you are not BDD. And so I think that was definitely like a wake up call for me. And like, I mean, obviously to this day, this is 14 years later. And I very vividly remember the conversation. I just was like, what did you read? Like, did you go on the DSM-5? Like, what did you, I was 4 at the time, DSM-4, but I was just like, it was so I think it's a balance. And the one last thing I'm going to say about telling people, just make sure you're telling them for the right reasons. Don't tell them because you want to get reassurance about what you look like. And I've seen the balance of it. So sometimes I say, look, if you're going to tell them because you need emotional support when you're struggling, great. But if it's because you want to share to them when you're struggling with your concerns of appearance and you need reassurance, that's probably not the best thing for you.
Very wise advice. Yeah, I will add to this that I think the first question, if you're thinking about revealing the BDD, is to be able to ask yourself, is telling this person going to be helpful to me? And if the answer to that is no, then I wouldn't do it. And if the answer to that is no, then I think, that also raises questions about the relationship itself. Okay, so as we move on here, of course, my partner says he's attracted to me. He doesn't want to hurt my feelings. I mean, how many, how many of us have heard that before? Certainly, as a therapist, I hear that all the time. A lot of times I'll meet with people who are either married or in a relationship, and I'll say something like, "Well, presumably your partner finds you attractive," and they'll say to me, "Well, they have to tell me that. They don't want to hurt my feelings." But one of the things I also say in reply to that is, do you really think your partner would be with you? Do you really think that attractiveness is the only issue here? Aren't there other reasons why your partner wants to be with you that goes beyond attractiveness? Because, as other people will say, is that they know for themselves that they wouldn't want to just be with somebody who was attractive if they weren't also a nice person and caring and kind. I mean, I don't think most people would want to be in a relationship that also didn't have those other qualities.
Yeah, somebody had asked us on YouTube. They said, I have a desire to be beautiful so I can be enough for my partner. I'm thinking of leaving because it's so triggering since I'll never look a certain way. How do I navigate this? And I think this is the perfect slide, is that we have to trust that the person that's with us likes us for a multitude of reasons. Sure, our appearance may be one factor. They may think we're kind. They might be inspired by the things we do for others. They might think that our passions are interesting. And so if we start to put the relationship in the same paradigm that we kind of put, or the same bubble that we put BDD, when we have BDD and when individuals have BDD, they think that the center of the world is appearance. Other people don't think that way because they don't have the disorder. And so if your goal is to try to look perfect so your partner will stay, typically when we have BDD, we start pulling away from that partner. We're in our heads, we're asking reassurance, we're feeling bad about ourselves, and we're actually not showcasing the other aspects of ourselves that our partner likes. So trust that the person likes our holistic self and that our appearance isn't the make or break. So try to answer the question shortly that they asked, and to sum it up, please don't spend your whole relationship trying to look perfect. It's a trap, and the BDD will always move the goalpost, and you'll never be good enough for BDD. It just won't work.
And to go off of that, I'm going to say BDD is, having BDD ultimately means you do not know what you look like. So relinquishing that notion, right? And so that can't be what defines you. And I think this idea also, like I've had clients and people say to me, but like, they're just with me because they feel bad. And I'm like, nobody in this world is with somebody because they feel bad. Like
nobody's that nice.
And it's, yeah, I just, but BDD, guess what? BDD loves to throw things at us that don't make logical sense. Been there, done that with the same thought process, but nobody in life is Mother Teresa that just takes time out of their life to be in a relationship unless it's fulfilling. And I know somebody had asked a question, and I think asked like, a supportive partner is willing to take this journey with you can be incredibly helpful, but they have to really invest. I'm going to say this. I think when you're in a good state of recovery, your partner, and I think there's a slide later on, should not necessarily be your therapist, should not be the person that's helping you stay in recovery. They should understand, just like anybody with any illness, they should understand that you're struggling, but they don't necessarily have to take on the role as your clinician, nor should they. And then I think the other question was like, I don't like what I see in the mirror now, or can't use the mirror, will I ever? I'm going to say that the definition of yourself for at least myself and the my presenters, like they can speak to this themselves. For me, the mirror is never going to be what dictates how I feel about myself and how I stand up each and every day as a person. I tried that. It did not work. It failed me, and it left me with essentially no quality of life. So I have actively chosen to not use the mirror, to not use my reflection, to not use my physical appearance to be the barometer of who I am in this world and who I will be in my next relationship. I don't know if I don't know if you guys can see that question in the Q&A box.
I use the mirror today when I need it. And I think that's the huge difference. I had such a obsession with checking a mirror. And now for me, it's like if I'm washing my face, brushing my teeth, and I have to look in it, I'll use it. I have a mirror behind me that you can kind of see. I probably look in that once a day after I eat lunch if I don't get to brush my teeth, to make sure my next client doesn't see that I have food in my teeth. But you end up having a healthy relationship with it. I don't sit there and zoom in on things I don't like or scan and stuff like that. But just like Robyn said, I don't base my entire worth on what I see in reflection, whereas prior to treatment, and most clients before they get treatment too.
Yeah, certainly very important stuff. I often like to say that, as somebody with BDD and as somebody who has had, various relationships, I think and I don't mean just intimate relationships, I also mean relationships with family members and friends, is that it is important for us too to recognize that these other people suffer too. They may suffer in a way that's different than we do, and they may not experience the same level of pain. But this is a very difficult relationship for family members. And I just think that, we want to be mindful of that too. We want to be mindful of what their experiences are like with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think you summed it up really well. It's like when we're in it, we're so in our heads, we don't realize that other people care. I feel horrible. I wish I could go back to all my exes and say I was dealing with something, I promise. So that going back to that first slide in this sequence, that's why for me, it was when I was finally ready to be in a relationship, I realized that I didn't put them through it. But I put them through a lot of stuff in the beginning, but have to have some self-compassion. It was never intentional.
Of course.
Yeah, I think, like Scott said, it goes beyond just like the intimate relationships. I mean, I'm 42 years old. I was diagnosed 20 years ago, and I still have yet to have the conversation with my mother. She did not, I did a documentary and she did not want to speak on camera with her experience. And we have yet to have that conversation. And we need to have that conversation. I want to hear her. I want to know what her experience was. I know she was in a lot of pain. I don't feel a sense of guilt. I know what I have compassion for myself, but I think her voice needs to be heard too, because she hasn't been heard. I just don't think she just didn't feel that on camera was going to be a place for her to share that for the first time ever. So I do think it does affect all facets in relationships, and BDD ravages ourselves, and so essentially will probably hurt everything that we touch. And so understanding that and being compassionate about it.
I don't know if the two of you know this, but about 20 years ago, I was interviewed for a documentary on BDD by the Discovery Channel.
No.
I think the title of it is "I Feel So Ugly." If you Google that, you'll find it. But one of the reasons I'm mentioning it is that my mother's interviewed during it, and as you know, my mother recently died, and so I just watched it not too long ago, and it was really amazing for me again to hear what this was like for her, and the pain and the fear that she was experiencing watching what I go through. Okay, I don't think we need to spend much time on this slide. I do think that most people with BDD that I know ought to be taking medication as well as doing psychotherapy, of course. And I think if you're not doing that, one of the things to think about again is what impact is all of what you're going through having on significant relationships in your life. So why don't we move on to I'm sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say, I agree with you. Cognitive behavioral therapy, ERP, and then kind of beyond to deal with the underlying stuff is the reason the three of us can be clinicians now. So it's testament to the work.
Now, I will say, in terms of marital and couples therapy, this is a very complicated issue, I think. I mean, I think part of this may be important in part because of what it's like for you and your partner to be living with the BDD. It's as if there's this third entity in the relationship that needs to be addressed. But I think where it gets particularly complicated is that there's more to this than just the BDD symptoms. Is that what about the relationship itself? What about the relationship may be a contributing factor to the exacerbation of the BDD symptoms? And so that's something that I think ordinarily does need to be addressed, whether you're in marital therapy or not. And again, I think that it is important for many partners to understand what it's like for you to be living with this, and for them to be hearing from a therapist to what it's like to have this problem. Chris or Robyn, any thoughts on this one?
I was just going to say briefly, for my first relationship, we did go to couples therapy, and I agree. We know that stress, anxiety, et cetera, does exacerbate BDD symptoms. And so we had a lot of issues outside, obviously, just the disorder. And so because the relationship was volatile, it made the BDD worse, because of course I blamed all of our fights on my appearance. So we did go to couples therapy. Unfortunately, the other person thought they knew more than the therapist, so it ended up not really working out. But I could absolutely see how this may be valuable if you're in a long-term relationship, to make sure that the other factors in your relationship are also being addressed, so that our symptoms aren't out of control.
I'm just going to kind of go in a different direction really quickly and say, from my experience of dating, I wasn't going into the relationships for the right reasons. I wasn't going into the relationships to form an emotional bonds, emotional intimacy. I was going to the relationships because I wanted to feel like I was enough. BDD was so hard for me. And so I think for me, I don't know if I had any foundation in any of my relationships, to be quite honest, because I think I was not necessarily going in for the person. I was going in to fulfill a need within myself. And I think these are all things to start to explore. And I always like say, like, what is your drive? Like, you know, when you want to be with a person, you know, is it because you want to be with them, or because you love that they're telling you that you're good looking? You love that they're making you, you know, not question your concerns. And so I feel like for me, like what, you know, has led me these last few years is to really like look back and kind of go through and process and realize it's not like the relationships were that awful, but it wasn't necessarily like what I'm looking for now. Like I'm, you know, somebody that's there for me mentally, not just about BDD. It's like, I didn't even know to look for that, because essentially my BDD was just like, find someone that tolerates you, find someone that finds you attractive. And I feel like we have to just ask some of those questions too when you're like getting into relationships. So that we're just going to give that.
Yeah, right. I mean,
there are three
go ahead,
questions
Robyn.
also. Oh no,
Yeah,
I
I
was
mean,
going to say there are three questions.
what gets lost in all that is how you feel about the person, right? I mean, you know, and is this person right for you? Um,
Yeah.
Reassurance seeking. Well, you know, if it worked, we wouldn't have to ask for it so much. Um, and I do think that this is one of the ways that OCD and BDD overlap. But I think, and I'm curious, Chris and Robyn, what your thoughts about this, is that in OCD, the reassurance oftentimes works for a brief period of time. Um, you say to somebody, no, the oven's not on. The person may relax for a little while. They may ask the same question a few minutes later, but there does seem to be some relief in that. I find oftentimes with BDD, there isn't much relief. The person will ask for reassurance and won't believe what's being said anyway. And in fact, often gets angry. And which is always curious to me, if the person's hearing from somebody that they look fine, why get angry about it? But it oftentimes does result in that. And I think that's because the reason they may get angry is they're not getting the answer that they really want. I think the answer that they really are looking for is that they're okay. Um, and it's only being asked through physical appearance. And because of that, they're not really getting the answer that they want. But Chris, Robyn, thoughts on this?
Yeah, right. I mean,
Okay.
just what you said, reassurance never worked. I mean, I know, I remember like my dad came home, I had taken pictures my freshman year, and my dad came home and was like, oh, I had the pictures up at the office, and all the women and ladies were like, wow, your son's so handsome. And I had taken the pictures 2 weeks prior, and I was like, oh, but if they saw my skin now, they would think I was ugly. Or in my relationship, I would constantly be comparing to other people and ask like, oh, do I look better than this person, that person? It never worked. And I think because in OCD, it's around safety and reassurance. It's about being okay, belonging, and worthiness. And so it didn't work. And a lot of times I got frustrated if people didn't say what I wanted them to say exactly, or if they didn't see what I saw. I thought, well, I can't trust their opinion because they don't see it. I was going to say lastly on this, it's still to this day is like clear in my head. I had the opportunity to speak on the Montel Williams show about BDD. And I remember afterwards, like I was shaking his hand and thanking him for having me on the show. And he's like, I can't believe you have BDD, man. Like your face, like right here is like amazing. Like people would love to look like that. It's like a celebrity. And all I left with, what was wrong with this part of my face and this part of the face? And if I would change it, would you have said the whole thing? Like it backfired. And I felt hideous when I left the show and felt terrible and kind of spiraled. So it's like reassurance doesn't ever work, and it can make us even feel worse.
Yeah. And lastly, I'm just going to say, I know for myself, I've done a bunch of speaking arrangements, and one of my exes said to me, and it was in a nice way, but was like, I do not understand why you have self-image problems. And I'm just like, it felt so dismissive. Because obviously we know this goes beyond it. And I'm thinking to myself, the life I lost to this disease, to this disorder, somebody telling me they don't see what they see, it just doesn't really do anything for me. Truthfully, reassurance did zero, because essentially I felt defective and unworthy. And so I agree. I definitely agree with you, Scott, that it doesn't really do much. I think people with BDD all want to hear it, but I think universally what I seem to see with clients across the board is it does absolutely nothing. They don't hold on to it for more than a second. And then they think that the person's lying, or if the person saw them at 2 hours later, they would take back what they said. So I don't think reassurance seeking really provides any relief for anybody.
Yeah, and I think we always have to keep in mind that one of the reasons reassurance can't work is that BDD in truth is never really about how somebody actually looks. It's about a lot of other things, but it's not really about how somebody truly looks. Okay, Robyn alluded to this a little bit earlier. As far as your partner being an exposure therapy coach, we know that exposure therapy is pretty hard work. It's nobody's favorite thing to do, but we do know that it can be very, very effective. And so I know that for a lot of my clients, I certainly will talk about doing exposure therapy, and they'll have exposure therapy homework some of the time. But it's because it's so hard, they often need somebody who's a coach who can assist them with doing the exposure therapy on their own. However, if you're using a partner as your coach, that can be fine. But the person has to be obviously supportive. We don't want somebody being an exposure coach who is going to participate in some conflict and being very judgmental. So I think you just have to be very careful who you choose to be your coach in this regard. All right.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
I agree with you. Is this slide is that your partner's your partner and can support, and having a clinician to help navigate that so the dynamics of the relationship doesn't change.
Yeah, you're definitely not ever. I mean, I laugh because before I became a therapist, I worked in hospice, and somebody once on a dating site was like, I don't want to date a therapist. And I couldn't understand what that meant. And now I get it. I mean, essentially, you don't want to feel therapized when I don't even think that's a word, but people use it. You don't want to, that's not what the dynamic of your relationship is. I think there's a difference between somebody having you like emotionally, they're there for you through thick and thin. They have you like, and which I've never had in a relationship, like in a partner. But I think there's a difference between that and that person being like your therapist. And, so I think it's finding that balance. And I want to be
yes.
clear. I think that's too much stress to put on a partner. And I don't think it's healthy for the relationship overall. Myself as a therapist, I'm definitely not looking to take on somebody who has stuff that's thinking because I'm a therapist, they're going to be getting some therapy throughout our relationship. I mean, of course, I'm open to being with people who have struggles as I can understand that personally, but in no way am I going to take that on to be somebody's therapist in relation to a relationship. I don't think that that's very healthy.
No, that's a recipe for disaster, actually.
Right.
So we only have about 11,
10
12
minutes.
minutes. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
about 10 minutes. So let's get through this one quickly. This is perhaps obvious. Sometimes, if you're in a relationship, the relationship itself is important and your partner is important. And so sometimes, the BDD behaviors are going to have to wait. And that I do recognize that that's easier said than done. But this sort of relates to a slide we had up earlier, is that recognizing that your partner has needs too, and the relationship has needs. And you may need to be doing things that are beyond your comfort zone. Going some places sometimes when you'd rather where you would rather not. Um, this is a little bit blocked on my screen, but I think this means keeping up with daily activities as possible. That's true with anybody with BDD. You do want to be able to keep up with whether it's work and chores and spending time with important people in your life. I know it gets very, very difficult, but one of the worst things that people with BDD can do is to isolate themselves. And we all know that there's such a strong temptation to do that, but that truly only makes matters worse. So I do want my clients, and I'll say this for myself, it's important for myself to make sure that I'm keeping up with activities in life that ought to be important and ought to be more important than the BDD, frankly.
Yeah, isolating
I,
yourself is one of
yeah.
the worst things you can do with BDD. And I think that part of my treatment was just getting out and being around people and getting back with friendships and dating and engaging in other aspects of me that were important, like martial arts and tennis and a job. And so one thing I do with all my clients is I make sure that their day is filled outside the home, because isolating and being by yourself and not doing a daily routine can absolutely set you back. I know it's hard, but it's always worth it.
And again, the answer, this is about relationships, but the answer to the recovery is that we have to be more than BDD. We have to be more than our appearance to thrive and to get into recovery. appearance, I'm not going to sit here and say is not a facet of who we are, but it cannot be the defining factor. Almost every single person who comes in initially for treatment, including myself, it was like 90% of how I felt about myself was my appearance. We can't have that be. And so that's why it's important to step up to your life every day. It's important to have activities and interests. And if you don't have that, which I definitely didn't in my 20s, you need to find that. It's crucial for your identity. It's crucial for recovery. It's crucial to feel good. And it makes you feel like you are more than just what you see, which we already know is a distortion.
So we already spoke about the second item here, which is great. When I first began showing symptoms of BDD, there was next to nothing known about the disorder. And as I said, when I first showed symptoms, BDD was not a recognized diagnosis. However, that's very different today. There are some very good books on BDD, one of which I'm going to mention in a few minutes. There are a lot of articles, a lot of videos, and frankly, the BDD Foundation has done such an amazing job, and their website is wonderful. And so, please check that out. But there's a lot of information out there now, and it's important that you share that and that you and your partner learn about BDD together. Okay, let's. Communication is important. Obviously, I wanted to, in particular, get to. I think it's the next slide, but I do want to make
because I think there's four questions. We definitely want to make sure we try to answer those.
Anyway,
the next slide addresses one of the questions. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So just the concept of attunement, though, is the idea of being aware of your own feelings and your own feelings as well as the feelings of your partner. And I don't mean necessarily connected to BDD, but just to be able to be essentially in tune with what's going on for you and what's going on in the needs for your partner. Feeling understood, feeling loved, and certainly feeling connected are all necessary ingredients of BDD. All right, so here's a slide that I wanted to get to. Chris, you want to get to the question first?
Yeah, so the question was tips on approaching nudity. Being naked together is a big part of relationships, but it causes a lot of anxiety, especially if your BDD focuses on on body parts rather. How does that negatively impact sexual interaction? And I think this is such a good topic because already being in a relationship with BDD is tough, but then the ultimate vulnerability and potential rejection is being nude with another individual. And I know for me, my first partner who had BDD around was my first time having sex. And so I know for me, it was like the most vulnerable I ever felt. And it was less about the physical component. And to me, it was more like, with nothing camouflaging, because with BDD we're so used to camouflaging, I'm putting myself out there. Will this person reject it? So some strong kind of points, and you already kind of addressed them, is you got to make sure you feel comfortable with the partner. If you feel you need to let them know why being nude with them is so tough, that's where you can have that conversation about it and take it slow. Like I wasn't comfortable doing it the first time, like completely close off with bright lights, right? But I worked up to that because that was a value of mine. And I think gauging towards where we want to ultimately be is what should drive us. And so make sure that you're with a partner that will take it slow, will work with you at it, etc. But I think us as partners, we want to make sure that we are focusing on this if it's something that you and your partner value together, because I never want clients, and I never for myself wanted to make choices based on fear and not out of what were some of the goals or things that were important to me.
Robyn, anything you'd like to share about this?
Just, again, I think for me, when I think back to my 20s, I think I had a little bit of a different experience. I was able to show up in physical intimacy in very small amounts of time. I just, to me, couldn't expand upon that into more of an emotional intimacy in a day-to-day situation. So, because essentially like my BDD brain was like, you look okay and acceptable from 7 to 10 p.m. But like, if they saw you any other time, they would be repulsed by me. So I do think it's definitely, are you ready? I don't ever want people to think like there's this certain place in recovery where you're ready. I feel like you have to do both at the same time, right? So you have to be in treatment and be moving towards recovery and living life at the same time. I think that's very important. I think you should do it, at the same time versus saying, okay, when I finish all of treatment, obviously if you're in a lot of distress and you're very overwhelmed and this will take you over that side, then don't, enter into intimacy, physical intimacy if it's too much. But I do think it's important to do both at the same time, right? Be in treatment, but live at the same time versus being like, when treatment is done, then I'm going to do other things. I think it's about being open to doing it concurrently.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I will say nothing, in my opinion, makes people feel quite as vulnerable as having sex. And I think you do need, you want to be able to feel safe. And I think having that discussion with your partner and being with somebody who makes you feel safe is a very important part of this. And, I just mentioned the five senses exercise, but, if you're in the moment, you're getting physical, try to stay in the moment, try not to have the BDD overwhelm the experience. And if it does overwhelm the experience, it's fine to take a break. You shouldn't feel forced to have to do anything. But the five senses, where you're paying attention to your surroundings, something you can taste and hear and smell and touch and see, that helps you to stay in the moment. Because I know that in having BDD, it could certainly take you out of the moment, very, very easily. Okay, I know we're going to have to wrap up in just a moment.
Right. I know. And I just want to make, there's a few other questions. So someone asked this question and I'm going to say no to that. Can you be objectively ugly or disfigured and still have BDD? Well, the definition of BDD is a perception and distorted thought of one's appearance that nobody sees and that the outsiders really don't see and objectively nobody sees. So if you've been diagnosed with this disorder, then you have body dysmorphic disorder and your perception of what you see is not there. This notion that you weren't able to find a female friend until your late 30s was probably also related to your ability to feel like you deserve that and your ability to feel like to put yourself out there. So I feel like it's probably less to do with that you're objectively unattractive and probably more to do with the BDD made you feel isolated and less likely to push yourself to go out there.
Yeah, if I could answer that too, because we got a couple questions on the same thing. So we just answered them so that I always feel anxiety if we don't answer questions. A lot of times clients will say, well, I must be objectively ugly because people aren't dating me. What I work on with a client is they're not leaving their house. They're not engaging with people. When they're out, they're so in their head and focused on their appearance. And then they assume that people must not find them attractive because they're hideous and therefore they can't have BDD. It's about appearance. Nobody is really objectively ugly. I mean, to be ugly, not only do you physically have to be revolting, but your personality, the way you carry yourselves, it takes a lot for somebody to be objectively ugly, right? So I always find with my clients that they look normal, or sometimes they look above average, and it's not BDD. It's much more the way that they're carrying themselves around the opposite sex or the same sex if they're gay. That is what's really kind of driving a wedge between people. There's another question, could you have a physical disability and have BDD? Part of the definition is like, are you taking a hyperfixation on it that's outside the norm and other people don't see it as bad? So you can technically have a physical disability, but like Robyn said, if everybody is agreeing with you and sees it the same way, then no, it wouldn't be BDD. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't receive treatment and deal with some of the underlying issues about body image.
I do want to address the last thing for a moment because a lot of people don't recognize that this is in the DSM, but there's a subcategory of OCD that is body dysmorphic-like disorder with actual flaws. And so, these are people who may be burn victims or, have rosacea or, there's something obvious going on in their appearance. And so by definition, that would not be BDD. But this other part of the DSM does describe those people. So, all right. So I know we don't have time. I think this is obviously being recorded. So please, take an opportunity to review the rest of the slides. The rest of the slides are basically, Chris and I just mentioning, things going on in our lives, right now.
This book is great.
This is thank you.
Yes, I have it on my shelf. Get the book.
Yeah, me too. My go-to for clients.
Well, thank you. This is the book I wrote that came out a couple of years ago about not just my own experience, but a lot about my own experiences as a clinician, as a therapist, and as somebody who has the disorder, as well as many of my patients as well. This is Chris again. Contact info, Robyn. I don't think you had a chance to upload.
So I believe my contact information might be, I did Hear My Story documentary, and I think it's on the BDD Foundation website, but you can find me at rlsterntherapy.com or BDD OCD Therapist on Instagram.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So I think I speak for the three of us that this is my contact information. This is Chris's. If you didn't have a chance to ask questions or other questions have popped up and you'd like to ask them, please feel free to reach out to us. We're always happy to respond. I know we're right up against the time. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure to be with you. Yes, you can have BDD and you can have successful relationships. Robyn, Chris, any quick final thoughts?
Just thank you to the, oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say quickly is like, I just hope what people's resounding message that they got from this is just because you have BDD does not mean that you shouldn't be in relationships. Absolutely should you. Quickly, and we should definitely see if the BDD Foundation would let us do a talk on this. Somebody asked, like, outside of CBT and ERP, can you do other therapy for BDD? And you didn't quickly, Scott showed it in his slide, like he went back for much more deeper therapy work.
Right.
I know I did and Robyn did, so maybe we could do a part on that. But yes, you want to deal with some of the underlying attachment. So I think one of the gentlemen who asked the question, that would help him, is that underlining attachment so that your appearance doesn't keep taking the blame. But please go out and date if that's a value of yours. Don't let BDD take it away from you.
Absolutely.
And I just want to say that we are all more than our appearance. You are not what you see. You deserve to live a full life. We are examples of people that have up and downs within our own recovery. There is life with BDD. There is relationships. You are not alone. I want to thank the BDD Foundation for all their amazing work. I want to thank everyone who came on today, and we're here for you, and you are not alone.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Okay.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
thank you to the foundation for having us.
You.
We really appreciate all the work that it's doing, and please watch this back and share it.
Yes, thank you.